travel invisibly from that garden to Mehmet's field, through the air, on the wind, on the legs of an insect, and wipe out an entire harvest before a single visible symptom appeared on a single stalk. Mehmet had never heard of the buffer zone law. Most farmers haven't. Most people growing these crops in their gardens right now have no idea that within 500 meters of certified agricultural land, what they are doing is not gardening. It is a legal liability. Welcome to the Anatolian peasant. Last spring, a wheat farmer named Mehmet in Konya province did something he had done every season for 30 years. He walked the edge of his field at dawn, checked the soil, checked the sky, and then walked back to his farmhouse satisfied. The crop looked clean. The stalks were strong. The season was going to be good. 3 weeks later, an inspector from the Darim v. Ormanbakken Ligi arrived at his gate. Not because of anything Mehmet had planted. Because of what his neighbor had planted 400 meters away, on the other side of a crumbling stone wall, in a garden that had been growing the same way for generations. By the time the inspector left, Mehmet's neighbor had received a formal citation. The crop in question, something you could find in home gardens across the Aegean, something sold in bazaars, something with a history in Anatolian soil stretching back centuries, had to be removed within 30 days. Not because it was poisonous, not because it was invasive, because it was a biological bridge, a living highway for a fungal disease that could travel invisibly from that garden to Mehmet's field, through the air, on the wind, on the legs of an insect, and wipe out an entire harvest before a single visible symptom appeared on a single stalk. Mehmet had never heard of the buffer zone law. Most farmers haven't. Most people growing these crops in their gardens right now have no idea that within 500 meters of certified agricultural land, what they are doing is not gardening. It is a legal liability. Welcome to the Anatolian Peasant Farmers channel. Today we are counting down 10 crops, some beloved, some ancient, some sold openly in every pazar from Istanbul to Diyarbakir, that Turkish agricultural law has drawn a hard line against. A literal, measured line in the soil. Not here. Not within 500 meters. Not without a permit. Not without consequences. Some of these plants have been growing in Anatolian gardens since before the Ottoman Empire existed. The Darim v. Ormanbakken Ligi, Turkey's Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, has classified every one of them as a phytosanitary threat, a disease vector, or an ecological hazard serious enough to require buffer zone enforcement, mandatory eradication orders, or outright cultivation bans. From a vine that carries a rust fungus capable of destroying an entire province's wheat crop, to a fruit tree that hosts a moth whose larvae cost Turkish farmers over 200 million lira in a single season. And wait until we get cooperatives, before scientists discovered it was quietly spreading a disease with no cure. The garden in Anatolia was never as innocent as it looked. Let's get into it. Turkey's citrus industry is worth over $1 billion annually. The Cukurova Plain and the Mediterranean coastline between Mersin and Antalya are among the most productive citrus-growing regions on Earth. And somewhere along that coastline right now, a citrus tree that nobody in Turkey ever intended to eat is spreading into the undergrowth, forming walls of thorns 2 meters tall and refusing every attempt to remove it. Poncirus trifoliata, UC Yaprocli portacle, the 3-leaved orange, looks like a citrus tree that has been slightly wrong about itself. The leaves grow in threes, which is unusual for the Rutaceae family. The fruit is golf ball sized, covered in fine fuzz, loaded with seeds and barely any juice. The flavor's so aggressively bitter that it makes the face contract involuntarily. The smell unmistakably of citrus. The tree itself is armored, thorns up to 8 centimeters long, dense enough to stop a person from pushing through. Nobody planted it to eat it. Poncirus was introduced to Turkey as a rootstock, the underground half of a grafted citrus tree. Its extraordinary cold hardiness surviving temperatures that destroy standard citrus varieties made it invaluable to growers in areas at the frost-line edge of the Cukurova and Antalya regions from the mid-20th century onward. Commercial oranges and lemons grew on Poncirus roots across the entire Mediterranean coast. The fruit above the graft was the product. The root below was the infrastructure. The problem is what happens when Poncirus seeds fall outside the orchard boundary. It naturalizes aggressively. It grows from seed without assistance. The thorns make mechanical removal dangerous. Cut it to the ground and it regrows from the root system within a single growing season. By the 2000s, feral Poncirus populations had established themselves along roadsides, forest edges, and abandoned agricultural land across Mersin, Adana, and Hatay provinces. Turkish Forestry Service reports from 2009 to 2012 documented it displacing native maquis shrubland in protected natural areas directly adjacent to the citrus orchards whose roots it had escaped from. Regional agricultural directorates in Mersin and Adana began issuing advisories against new planting outside certified rootstock programs in 2013. Formal restrictions were codified by 2016 under Invasive Alien Species Management Guidelines aligned with EU Regulation 1143/2014. Poncirus trifoliata cannot be sold or planted outside licensed nursery programs in the southern coastal provinces, and yet it remains legally required as rootstock in the orchards growing directly beside the land where it is banned as a weed. The same tree, the same root system, the same seeds falling from the same branches, legal on one side of an orchard fence, classified as an invasive species on the other. The Poncirus arrived with credentials. It performed exactly the function it was brought in to perform. Then it simply kept going. It never needed permission to begin. It certainly did not ask for permission to spread. It arrived in Anatolia in the 16th century from the Americas, aboard Ottoman trade vessels returning from North Africa. For 400 years, it was considered harmless, a roadside curiosity, a food source for goats, a living fence on Mediterranean smallholdings. Then ecologists measured what it had been quietly doing to Aegean and Mediterranean coastal ecosystems since the day it arrived. The prickly pear, hint in Syrian Turkish, literally Indian fig, grows in dense, impenetrable pads along the Aegean and Mediterranean coastline. The fruit is actually edible, sweet, delicate, slightly melon-like, sold by street vendors in coastal towns every August. If you have walked a Turkish seafront in summer, you have almost certainly passed someone selling it from a cart, the deep red-orange flesh halved and offered on a stick, one of the small, unremarkable pleasures of a country with an extraordinary food culture. The pads are another matter. They carry two types of spine, large, visible thorns and invisible glockets, microscopic barbed needles that detach on contact and embed in skin, eyes, and mucous membranes, causing inflammation that can last for weeks. The plant is not aggressive in the way a predator is aggressive. It is aggressive in the way a bureaucratic obstruction is aggressive, passive, structural, nearly impossible to resolve once it has established itself in the wrong place. The ecological mechanism is displacement, Opuntia grows faster than native Mediterranean maquis shrubland species, Kermes oak, lentisk, myrtle, and forms impenetrable monocultures that shade out native ground flora, collapse native insect habitat, and block access to coastal cliff breeding sites used by native reptile and bird populations. On the Aegean Islands and the Antalya coastal strip, Opuntia has replaced native vegetation on an estimated 15 to 20% of uncultivated coastal land. For centuries of slow advance, pad by unnoticed pad, while everyone was eating the fruit and feeding the goats and thinking nothing of it. In 2014, Turkey's Sevrivi Sihirslik, the Ministry of Environment, formally classified Opuntia ficus indica as an invasive species under Turkish environmental regulation, mandating impact assessments for any intentional new planting and removal programs in protected coastal and nature reserve zones. Removal has proven nearly impossible. Mechanical clearing allows regrowth from any surviving root fragment. The glochid spines make manual removal dangerous without specialist equipment. Herbicide application in coastal zones is restricted under groundwater protection rules. The 2014 classification was not the beginning of a solution. It was the formal acknowledgement that the problem had already won. Commercial cultivation for fruit production continues legally on agricultural land. The plant that is classified as an ecological threat in a protected nature reserve is simultaneously harvested for street food 50 meters away. 400 years. Not once asked to leave. Not once particularly concerned about being asked. The Turkish government promoted it. Agricultural extension agents recommended it for erosion control. Southeastern farmers planted it along riverbanks by the thousand across the gap, the Güneydoğu Anadolu Projesi, the largest irrigation development project in Turkish history through the 1980s and 1990s. The reports said it was a solution. Then the Euphrates tributaries started changing. The quince sava is one of Anatolia's most ancient cultivated fruits, referenced in Hittite agricultural texts, and possibly one of the original fruits of the Fertile Crescent. The flesh is hard and astringent raw, transforming completely when cooked into a golden, honey-scented preserve. Turkish avar resili, quince jam, sits on the breakfast table of nearly every Turkish home in winter. The tree is beautiful, white-pink blossom in spring, large golden fruit in October, branches heavy enough to bend toward the water it was planted beside. A government recommending it for riverbank stabilization was not an unreasonable decision. Quince is deep-rooted, fast-establishing, productive, and culturally beloved. On paper, it was exactly the right plant for the job. The problem was feral dispersal. Quince planted for erosion stabilization along gap irrigation canals and Euphrates tributary banks established wild populations faster than anyone had modeled. Feral quince forms dense, thorny monocultures along riparian corridors, outcompeting native riparian vegetation, tamarisk, poplar, willow, that provide habitat for migratory birds and native fish populations. The Fire River Basin showed measurable narrowing of channel width in affected zones by the early 2000s, attributed in part to sediment trapping by feral quince root systems expanding into the water margin. The tree that had been planted to hold the bank in place was holding it too well, contracting it, redirecting it, slowly converting a river corridor into a quince monoculture that nothing else could penetrate. Environmental impact assessments conducted by Heron University's agricultural faculty between 2003 and 2006 documented feral quince spread across 3 Euphrates tributary corridors and recommended removal from designated riparian buffer zones. The Darim v. Hormenbachenligie issued regional advisories in 2008 restricting new quince planting within 200 meters of designated watercourses in Gap provinces, including Sanliurfa, Gaziantep, and Adiyaman. Removal programs have since been conducted at considerable public expense. The same government that recommended planting it has spent the years since paying to dig it out. Cultivated quince remains fully legal, commercially important, promoted as a heritage agricultural product. The restriction targets only feral and self-seeded populations in protected riparian zones, which is to say, it targets exactly the populations that exist because the government put them there. The quince did not misbehave. It did precisely what quince does. It established, it spread, it held the ground it was given, and then it held more ground than anyone had intended to give it. The government called it a solution. The river disagreed. The black mulberry did not contain alcohol. It could not be fermented into wine without considerable additional effort. And yet, during the most severe periods of Ottoman alcohol prohibition, black mulberry orchards across Anatolia were inspected, regulated, and in some urban areas ordered destroyed, because what their juice could become was enough to make it dangerous. The black mulberry, Karadut, is one of Anatolia's most ancient fruits. The trees live for centuries. Some specimens in rural Anatolian villages are believed to be over 500 years old, their gnarled trunks wider than a man's reach, their root systems older than any administrative boundary drawn around them. The berries stain everything they touch, fingers, lips, cloth, with a deep, almost violent purple. The flavor is intensely sweet and tart simultaneously, unlike any other fruit grown in this soil. Anatolian villages harvest them by spreading sheets beneath the branches and shaking. The berries fall in a purple rain. The problem was mulberry wine, dutluk, or dutrakisi, which non-Muslim communities, particularly Armenian and Greek populations across Anatolia, produced in significant quantities from black mulberry must. During periods of strict Islamic governance, the production and sale of all fermentable fruit products, including mulberry, was subject to state inspection. Sultan Murad IV, who reigned from 1623 to 1640, and who according to contemporary accounts personally enforced alcohol bans with a severity that extended to execution, ordered inspections of urban mulberry orchards for unlicensed fermenting operations. The mulberry was not wine, but it was the raw material for wine. In the hands of communities the state was already watching. Ottoman court records from the 1630s document the destruction of mulberry orchards in Istanbul's Galata district, historically the center of the city's non-Muslim winemaking communities, following enforcement of Murad IV's prohibition. The orchards were not destroyed because of anything inherent to the mulberry. They were destroyed because of who owned them, what those owners were known to do with the fruit, and what the state had decided to make impossible. The prohibition was never absolute or permanent. It was lifted and reinstated across different reigns, tightened and loosened according to the political temperature of each sultan's court. The mulberry orchards of Anatolia survived into the Republican era. The formal dissolution of Islamic alcohol law as state policy came with the Tanzimat reforms and definitively with the 1923 Republic. Black mulberry is fully legal in Turkey today. Dut pekmezi, mulberry molasses, is a protected traditional food product. The trees that survived the Galata inspections are still standing in some cases, their trunks carrying 5 centuries of a history that the official record only partially captured. The mulberry was never the threat. Going in the wrong hands, in the wrong district, in the wrong century. That was enough. Turkey is the birthplace of the fig year. The Aegean town of Aydin grows the saralop, the finest dried fig in the world, with a geographical indication protection that rivals champagne in its legal weight. It has been cultivated in this valley for at least 6,000 years. And for the past 60, the fig's own wild ancestor has been systematically eradicated from the irrigation deltas that made that cultivation possible. The wild Capri fig, Yabani sir, is not edible in the way its cultivated cousins are. The flesh is sparse, seedy, bitter. It produces no commercial fruit worth harvesting. But it is the biological engine without which commercial fig cultivation cannot exist, because it houses the fig wasp, Blastophagacines, the sole pollinator of the entire ficus genus. The fig wasp completes its entire life cycle inside the Capri fig. It is born inside it, mates inside it, and emerges carrying the pollen that fertilizes the cultivated saralop hanging in the orchards nearby. Without wild Capri fig trees within range, commercial fig orchards cannot achieve caprification, the pollination process that determines whether a fig becomes the finest dried fruit in the Mediterranean or drops from the branch empty. The farmers of Aydin have known this for centuries. They manage it deliberately, cutting branches of Capri fig laden with emerging wasps and hanging them among their cultivated trees at precisely the right moment in the pollination window. The relationship between the wild tree and the commercial orchard is not accidental. It is ancient, understood, and carefully maintained. The problem emerged as large-scale irrigation agriculture expanded through the Bayak Menderes and Gediz River deltas in the 1950s and 1960s. Wild Capri fig trees growing along irrigation canal banks were identified as hosts for a secondary threat, fig mosaic virus, transmitted by the Assyria ficus eriophyid mite. The wild trees were acting as a permanent disease reservoir, reinfecting commercial saralop orchards season after season through a mite that moved invisibly between the two populations. The pollinator host and the disease reservoir were the same tree. In 1962, the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture issued phytosanitary clearance orders for wild Capri fig eradication within 500-meter buffer zones of certified saralop production areas across Aydin, Izmir, and Mugla provinces. The contradiction was immediately apparent to the farmers who received the orders. Remove the tree that carries the wasp your orchard cannot survive without, because the same tree carries a disease your orchard cannot survive either. The state's solution was to replace wild stock with certified disease-free Capri fig orchards, managed by the Aydin Insur Arasterma Institusu under controlled caprification programs. The wild tree was not eliminated. It was nationalized. The wasp was not lost. It was administered. Wild Capri fig planting within protected saralop zones remains restricted to this day. The fig that built this valley's identity survives because the state decided to manage its own pollinator. The wild ancestor is still out there, under license. For over 300 years, the Anatolian poppy field was not a scandal. It was a pharmacy, a trade good, and a lifeline for rural farming families in Afyonkarahisar, Kütahya, and Isparta. The Ottoman Empire supplied medicinal opium to the entire world. Then the world decided that was a problem, and Turkey paid the price. The opium poppy blooms in white, purple, and deep burgundy across the chalky limestone plateaus of western Anatolia. The seed capsule Hashish tozu yields both the narcotic latex and the culinary poppy seed central to Turkish bread, borek, and pastry traditions stretching back generations. Villages in Afyonkarahisar province organized their entire agricultural calendar around the poppy for centuries. The smell at harvest is faintly sweet, vegetal, unmistakable, a scent so embedded in the landscape of western Anatolia that it became part of the region's identity, inseparable from the soil that produced it. The compound at the center is morphine, and by chemical conversion, heroin. Ottoman and early Republican Turkey operated licensed poppy cultivation openly, supplying legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturers across Europe. The same supply chains, however, were exploited by illicit processors. By the post-World War II period, Anatolian opium was a documented source in the global heroin trade, not because Turkish farmers were producing heroin, but because the raw material they legally produced was being diverted after it left their fields. The farmers grew the poppy. Someone else made it a problem. International pressure, driven primarily by the United States government, facing a domestic political crisis around heroin availability in American cities, culminated in a complete Turkish ban on opium poppy cultivation in 1971 under Prime Minister Süleyman Demirel. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. An estimated 100,000 Anatolian farming families lost their primary income source in a single season. Fields that had been planted continuously for 3 centuries went empty. A landscape defined by purple and white bloom through spring became, overnight, a landscape of prohibited memory. The ban lasted 3 years. It was reversed in 1974 when it became undeniable that the primary effect had been to redirect the global heroin supply from licensed Anatolian processors to unlicensed Afghan ones, while doing nothing measurable to reduce drug use in American cities. The geopolitical calculation had failed on its own stated terms. 100,000 families had paid the price of its failure. Relegalization came with conditions. Farmers must register each field with the Toprak Masalari Office, the Soil Products Office. Harvesting is monitored from seed to capsule. The latex is extracted by state processors only. Unlicensed planting of a single poppy plant in a private garden carries criminal penalties under Turkish narcotics law. The seed, however, is legal. The hashas on your simit this morning came from the same capsule whose latex, unharvested, would constitute a criminal act. The line between them is a state license. Nothing else. It looks identical to a sweet almond. It grows on the same tree. It smells, when crushed, like marzipan, warm, sweet, almost comforting. Eat 12 of them, and the cyanide content is sufficient to kill an adult. The bitter almond is native to Anatolia, the wild progenitor of the sweet almond that now feeds the world. It grows in the rocky hillsides and river valleys of the Aegean and Mediterranean coast, flowering in pale pink in February before any other tree on the hillside has stirred. The nuts are identical to their sweet cousins in size, in shape, and the papery skin that comes away between the fingers. They smell identical. The difference is invisible until the moment it is not, which is the precise quality that makes this tree one of the most quietly dangerous plants in the Anatolian landscape. The compound responsible is amygdalin, a cyanogenic glycoside that metabolizes in the human digestive system into hydrogen cyanide. The bitter almond contains 40 to 70 times the amygdalin concentration of sweet almond varieties. Historically, Anatolian communities used tiny quantities of bitter almond oil in cooking and folk medicine. The flavor it contributes is real, the traditional applications are documented, and the margin between a culinary quantity and a lethal dose is extraordinarily, unforgivingly narrow. Documenting cases in rural Aegean and Mediterranean communities, children mistaking bitter for sweet almonds during harvest season, when both fall from adjacent trees into the same basket, appear in Ottoman medical literature as early as the 18th century. The confusion is not negligence. It is the logical consequence of a plant that evolved to look exactly like something safe, in an environment where the safe version grows within arm's reach. Following the establishment of the Turkish Republic, the 1952 Turkish Food Codex formally prohibited the sale of raw bitter almonds in markets and restricted bitter almond oil to licensed industrial processing only. A 2011 revision to the Turk Gida Codexi tightened restrictions further, bringing Turkey into alignment with EU Regulation 1334/2008, which caps bitter almond flavoring in food products at 0.5 milligrams of hydrocyanic acid per kilogram. The tree itself is not banned. It still grows wild across the Aegean hillsides, flowering every February in the same pale pink as its sweet cousin, indistinguishable at a distance. It is cultivated by licensed processors for essential oil extraction. Bitter almond oil is a legitimate industrial ingredient, appearing in flavoring compounds, cosmetics, and pharmaceutical preparations around the world. But for the farmer who harvests it without a processing license, selling the raw nut at market carries criminal liability under Turkish food safety law. The tree is protected. The nut is prohibited. The flower is beautiful. 12 of them is the number. Researchers have verified it. 12 bitter almonds, consumed by an adult of average weight in a single sitting. The tree does not advertise this. It is one of the most prized fruits in the Mediterranean world. Deep crimson flesh, a flavor that sits between orange and raspberry, a pigment so vivid it looks like something is wrong with it. In 1837, Sultan Mahmud II banned its import entirely. The reason had nothing to do with taste, and everything to do with what was hiding inside the shipments. The blood orange, Malta portocali, arrived in Ottoman port cities through Maltese and Sicilian trading vessels in the early decades of the 19th century. Its flesh ranges from deep ruby to almost black red depending on cold exposure during ripening. The anthocyanin pigments that give it that color producing a juice that stains a glass like wine. Istanbul's elite had developed a taste for it. Merchants stocked it in the covered bazaars of Kapalı at a considerable premium. It was a luxury import with an established market and a growing reputation, exactly the kind of commodity the Ottoman trading system was designed to move in volume. The problem arrived in 1836, not in the fruit itself, but in the wooden crates and soil packing material traveling with the shipments. Mediterranean fruit fly larvae, Ceratidis capitata, were identified by Ottoman agricultural inspectors in blood orange imports at the port of Istanbul. The larvae had already spread to citrus trees in the Aegean coastal regions before the contamination was traced back to its source. The fruit had been the vessel. The pest had been the cargo. By imperial firman dated 1837, Sultan Mahmud II issued a prohibition on the import of fresh blood orange produce from Maltese and